Welcome everyone to this first of the 2021-22 Almont Lecture season. My name is Warren Thorngate. I'm one of 4 people who helps organize the lectures and makes them happen. I want to acknowledge that the other 3 are Mel Turner, a technical wizard, Jan Johns, a technical wizard, and Glenda Jones, who does our publicity wizard. We're using Zoom for this season to try to cope with COVID restrictions. But we're still trying to offer 6 lectures for the season. If you want to know more about the other 5 lectures and the 6th one tonight, you can find the titles and descriptions on our website. And our website is Almont Lectures, all one word, almontlectures.com or almontlectures.net. And just a reminder, please turn off your microphones. It's to avoid dogs barking or sirens going by and so forth. And if possible, save your questions until after the lecture, either using the raise your hand feature of Zoom, which is under the reactions button, or by typing in a question on chat. A little prelude to tonight's presentation. I taught at a university for 40 years. And one of the things I learned from that is universities aren't like what they used to be. They've changed quite dramatically. And some of the things I've noticed is that universities have become much more like corporations with a corporate mentality. There's been a focus on bottom lines and enrollments, and what I call a change of philosophy of students as customers. There's also an increasing emphasis on job preparation, internships, practical training, certificate programs, entrepreneurial skills for startup companies, and so forth, which leads to a number of interesting questions. How are universities doing this? How successful are they in their efforts? And should universities be doing this at public expense, or should it be more of a profit-making gesture? Tonight's speaker will try to address some of these and similar questions. The speaker tonight is Professor Chris Evans. He has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Ottawa. He was a professor at the University of Iceland for several years. Then he returned to Canada and became a professor at Ryerson University, soon to be renamed, I think. He became the chemistry department chair. He was the vice provost academic of Ryerson. He was the acting provost for a while as well. And beginning, I think it's on the 1st of September this month, he's now the new executive director of the Ontario University's Council on Quality Assurance, which he may explain, I hope, during his talk. Best of all for me, Chris has been a good friend of mine for over 3 decades. He's about to talk now on the issues I mentioned with the title, Should University Teach Startup Culture? Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Warren, and thanks for the introduction, and thank all of you for being here tonight. So if you bear with me for a second, I'm just going to share my screen and get my presentation up. So give me a moment to do that. And I'm just going to minimize the video part and let me do this. And I hope you don't mind, because I am a scientist and I feel I'm entitled to be a bit nerdy. I will use my little laser pointer feature. Thank you, Warren, as I said, for the introduction. So my topic tonight is, should universities teach startup culture? And I hope that by the end of this, I will have convinced you that that's not an unreasonable thing for them to do. But as I go through, you will hear me confirm some of the things that Warren said around the corporatization of universities and the focus on the bottom line. I personally don't necessarily view those as bad things. And I think the focus on the bottom line is inevitable because of the changing ways in which governments have chosen to fund universities in Ontario, and I think more widely across Canada. But putting that aside for the moment, let me just get started. And I apologize for using PowerPoint. I'm not one of those people who can speak extensively just off the cuff. I do need some guidance, and the PowerPoint helps keep me on track. So for those of you who hate PowerPoint, I apologize. So I'm going to just start by giving you a brief overview of the talk. It's very straightforward. I'm going to start by talking about some general stuff. So basically to give some context. And then I'm going to talk about something I know a fair bit about. I'm going to talk about promoting startup culture at Ryerson University, and as Warren mentioned, soon to have a new name. Remains to be seen what that name will be. I'm going to use that as a kind of a more concrete example of the types of things I'm talking about. Once I get through that part of the lecture, I'm going to try to step back a bit and look at things in a little bit more of a broad context. And then at the very end, attempt to answer that question: should universities teach startup culture? So that's the path that I plan to follow tonight. So I think I'll just get started. So some general stuff, or maybe putting it a different way, a bit of background, a bit of context, a bit of an introduction. So I'm going to start at the beginning, and I'm going to try to define for everybody what startup culture actually is. And the way to do that is to really, I think, start by actually defining what a startup is. So a startup is a company or a project that's undertaken by a person who is an entrepreneur to seek, develop, and validate a scalable business model. Startups refer to new businesses or enterprises that intend to grow beyond the original founder. So the entrepreneur who starts who initiates a startup is typically referred to as a founder. It may be one person, it may be several people, doesn't really matter. But the intention of that individual or individuals is to not just do what I might do as an entrepreneur, which would be to set up a hot dog cart in the middle of downtown Ottawa or the middle of downtown Elmont and be satisfied with that. They want to take their hot dog cart and turn it into an empire of hot dog carts. So that's their sort of motivating factor. So all that by way of saying that the people who initiate startups are entrepreneurs, but they're kind of a subset of the broader idea of an entrepreneur. Startup culture then is affiliated, of course, with this, and it's really the way of working or the workplace environment that fosters this kind of development. And in many ways, it tends to be kind of unstructured, freewheeling, a lot of drawing on a lot of different inputs to help the individual's move idea from simply being an idea to being something concrete, whether that's a product, a process, or what have you. And universities have over time become increasingly focused on promoting startups and startup culture as part of what they offer to students. And I'll go into that in more detail a bit later on. One thing I'll say before I leave the slide is often startup companies are somehow technology focused, that the process or the product that they're working on is a technology or is driven by technology or informed by technology. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it turns out in many cases. So I'm going to, with that little bit of background about what startups are and what startup culture looks like, I'm going to give an extraordinarily brief overview of the history of universities. So universities, I think we all know, they've been around for many centuries. And initially, their primary focus was on transfer of knowledge, or the process that we call teaching. Jumping forward to the 19th century, creation of knowledge became a major priority of universities. And that's, of course, the thing that we call research. And in many ways, that has become, over time, the primary focus of of universities. All universities continue to teach. Many are heavily focused on research. But since the middle of the last century and continuing on into this century, a new agenda has arisen at universities, and that's the idea of putting knowledge to use or applying knowledge, often through entrepreneurship. And this has been the source of the kinds of things that we're rather familiar with. Universities like MIT, Harvard, Stanford in the US, universities like the University of Toronto, and others in Canada, creating spin-off companies from their faculty and graduate student research through a process of entrepreneurship. Nowadays, all three of these missions are very common at universities across the Western world and beyond. So this is just a synopsis of some changes that have occurred over time in the way that universities view their reason for existence. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what forces or factors are driving this refocusing or this focusing on application of knowledge. And a lot of it, in a way, comes down to the idea of providing service to the societies that the universities find themselves in, often with an economic slant, but not always. So economic development is a key force that has been pushing universities towards this focus on application of knowledge. Universities are seen as a tool to promote innovation and economic strength in society. They are, by definition, a source of ideas. Some of those ideas can be harnessed to develop things, companies, what have you, processes, products, etc., that can be of value to the economic strength of a society. There is also a sense of growing accountability, and Warren kind of referred to this in his opening comments. At least in Canada, virtually every university is a publicly funded institution. So the money that supports it is really coming from the public in one form or another, whether it's student tuition fees or government grants. And the public would like to see some evidence that that money is being well spent. So this kind of pushes the universities into a situation where they need to, at least to some extent, demonstrate that they are good shepherds of public funding, that they're providing value for the money that they're receiving from the public. So that focus on accountability, that increased accountability, is another contributing factor to for universities to demonstrate their public good nature by providing something that is of value or deemed to be of value to society. There's also a bit of an identity crisis, at least in Ontario. Going back a number of provincial governments ago, the provincial government authorized colleges to start offering undergraduate degrees. And those are in direct competition in some cases with universities. So this has created a little bit of existential anxiety in the university sector, in the sense that the college's degrees tend to be more applied focused, more directly demonstratable, that they lead, in a kind of linear way to jobs. They can scaffold or ladder them on top of diplomas. So a student may go to a college, do a 2-year biotechnology diploma, and then be seamlessly able to continue into a subsequent couple of years of education that would allow them to complete a Bachelor of Science degree at that college as well. Most universities can't do things that seamlessly. The other factor here is universities, of course, have a research mandate. Colleges don't. Research mandate creates a large financial and infrastructural overhead, which colleges don't have to bear, which makes, at least from the government's perspective, the college route a more enticing or perhaps economically favorable pathway to education. So I think this has driven a little bit of an identity crisis in the university sector in Ontario. Another driver is generation of income. Warren talked about chasing the bottom line. So here it comes again. Dollars will be a repeated theme in this lecture. Universities hope that by supporting entrepreneurship, spin-offs, startup culture, and things like that, that they may hit the jackpot, have somebody discover some incredible invention, the ultimate mousetrap or whatever, that they can then make money from in terms of IP licenses and things of that nature, intellectual property licenses and royalties and things of that sort. Another factor is universities are in competition with one another. So they all want to focus on developing their reputation and brand themselves, yet another sort of marketing term there. And they want to brand themselves as progressive organizations. So this is another factor that pushes them to buy into the process of explaining their reason for existing in terms of providing a good to society. They, again, with the idea of chasing money, they want to align themselves with government priorities, and government priorities are often economic priorities, things like job creation, things of that nature. So if the universities want to access funds from the government that are tied to those kinds of priorities, they have to play that game and, depending on your point of view, perhaps pander or align themselves with those types of priorities. And the final thing I'll mention on this slide, the world of work has changed. So when I was young, and by the way, I have I know that some of you are from Carleton. I have an undergraduate and a master's degree from Carleton. So at the end of my undergraduate degree many years ago, I and my fellow cohort of students, I think most of us thought we'll get a job, we'll work for a company, we'll work for the government, something like that. And that will be a long-term proposition. We'll build up a pension fund and eventually retire. I think those days are gone. I think the world of work now is much more tentative, much more provisional. And the types of skills, again, a word that Warren mentioned, the types of skills that are deemed important to thrive in the modern world are, in addition to the hard skills like knowing how to design a circuit or program a computer, are soft skills like collaboration, communication, critical thinking, perseverance, things of that nature. And the universities, I think, have come to realize that it is important for them to provide opportunities for students to acquire these kinds of skills through their educational experiences in order to, again, demonstrate societal relevance. So how do the universities do this? So how do they promote entrepreneurship and startup culture in order, as a way of responding to those forces I just spoke about on the previous slide? Well, they do it in a variety of different ways, some of which are traditional and some of which are new, or at least new to the universities. So they do it through teaching, which of course is very traditional, through training programs in business schools. So many universities in Ontario and more widely across Canada now offer at least courses in entrepreneurship, and many of them offer full programs in entrepreneurship. And they also do it through the traditional route of spinning off companies from the research that goes on within the walls of the university, be it graduate student, faculty, or postdoctoral fellow research outcomes. But increasingly, they are looking at, and in some cases, implementing the processes of incubation and acceleration within the university. So what does that mean? Just to be sure that everybody is familiar with those terms. So what is incubation? An incubator, these are terms that do come from the world of business. I will be frank about that. But an incubator is really a series of program elements that is designed to help a very embryonic company start to develop. So it's often a physical space with certain logistic, financial, and mentorship supports in place designed to help a founder, or perhaps founders, who have come up with an idea that may be viable in terms of developing an enterprise or a business, and to kind of move it, get it going, and build it up a little bit. An accelerator really kind of in some ways is similar, except it takes a company that's already gotten on its feet and tries to move it into a greater state of stability and self-sufficiency. So in both cases, there are opportunities for the companies to access various kinds of supports, especially advice from mentors, contact with potential investors, things of that nature, as well as physical space where the company representatives can actually work. So this is new to the university sector. It's been around in the world of business for a while, but it's quite new to the university sector as a way of delivering on entrepreneurship, startup culture, and as I'll talk about in a few minutes, also trying to integrate that into the educational opportunities that universities provide. Because of this, I guess, initiation of entrepreneurship through incubation and acceleration processes, it's caused a bit of a shift in the type of people who may be able to take part in entrepreneurial processes within a university. Whereas in the past, as I mentioned, it's already primarily been faculty, postdocs, and graduate students doing research, and some of the research results can be harnessed for entrepreneurial activity to develop a spin-off. With the incubation and acceleration process, the threshold for getting something done seems to be somewhat lower. And so we're seeing a broadening of the people who are coming in and working as entrepreneurs. And in particular, we're seeing the participation of young undergraduate students. Even students as early as a second-year student seem to be able to, through these incubation, acceleration, startup culture types of activities, develop ideas that in some cases have legs. That's my sort of introductory section. So I'm going to move now into something I know in quite a bit of detail, which is promoting startup culture at Ryerson University. I realize and understand that not everybody buys into the type of model that I'll be talking about. But let me jump right in. Okay, my internet connection was unstable for a moment. Hopefully it's back to normal now. So I will just continue. So around 2010, a number of students approached the president at that time at Ryerson University. They wanted to have some space set aside for them to work on developing cell phone apps because they thought that they could turn their ideas into businesses. And the president at that time said, sure, I can, set aside a little bit of money from our operating budget. We'll rent you some space close to the campus and you folks can go ahead and do what you want to do. So that actually happened. Some space was rented. It was just a kind of a big empty room. But a number of student groups went in there and started working on developing their ideas around cell phone apps. So they were looking at things, for example, like an app to navigate or help you navigate around a large airport, or an app to help people in wheelchairs identify barrier-free restaurants, things of that nature. So ideas that didn't really require a huge amount of investment to develop and not even a huge amount of technological skill, but they were ideas that in some cases did have some longevity and ended up becoming companies. That happened in around 2010. And very quickly, it evolved into a full-blown incubator accelerator with lots of supports in terms of staff, in terms of programming that was made available to the participants, connections to investors, so bringing in funds through that route, as well as a very wide mentorship network. And I'm going to just stop for a moment and emphasize that idea of mentorship for these startup scenarios, these startup culture workspaces, incubators, and accelerators. Mentorship is extremely important. It's a hugely effective way for individuals starting a new company to get advice on how to do it in an effective and efficient manner, avoiding mistakes that other people have made in the past. So the mentorship network is a very important part of all of this startup culture stuff. Fast forward a number of years, the DMZ, as it's called, became ranked among the best campus-based accelerators in the world, not just in Canada, but globally speaking. And it has become a flagship feature of Ryerson's reputation. It's a site that's visited by many people. Well, pre-pandemic, it was visited by 4, 5, 6 tour groups a day, but not tour groups of tourists, but of potential investors, sometimes politicians, sometimes even celebrities. I've given a brief list here so you can get a sense of the kinds of people who are dropping by for a visit and a chat. The thing that is noteworthy beyond its success is that it has from the beginning and retained a very strong emphasis on viable business development. So most of what goes on in the DMZ, as it's known, is really about for-profit enterprise. But its connection with the educational mandate of the university was not so clear. It wasn't clear at the outset, but at the outset, it was a very small thing. Fast forward, a decade or so, it's become a big thing, and it's still not that connected to the educational mandate of the university. So by 2012, the people at Ryerson had figured out that the DMZ, as wonderful as it seemed to be, really wasn't helping students that much in terms of education. So a group of us got together and concocted something that we call zone learning. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But by 2013, this zone learning activity had launched and was available for student participation. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So zone learning, I've given it the subtitle here on this slide, a startup mimic. So I've already talked a little bit about what startups are. I've tried to give a bit of a flavor of what startup culture is, how the operation of a startup actually happens. Zone learning is an attempt to mimic that, but with an educational slant. So zone learning, what is it? It's an extracurricular activity. It's a learning by doing type of activity where students have the opportunity to work on an idea, a project, a cause, or a company that they develop themselves. So it's really student-led. And that was something that students at Ryerson seemed to think was valuable, that it was a place where they could come and a set of events which they could participate in, which would allow them to take an idea that they had and evolve it. Many of those ideas go nowhere, but some of them do. The focus has been and is on developing independent ventures. They could be for-profit businesses, but they don't have to be. There's never been a strong focus in the zone learning system of for-profit. It can be for-profit, it can be not-for-profit, it can be about social innovation, it can be a wide range of things. But regardless of the motivation of the participants, they tend to be, well, they always work as a team. The teams tend to be like-minded individuals, but they come from various backgrounds. So we often see students from various faculties and various programs working together on a startup idea. And that is actually an unusual feature for those of you who are familiar with modern universities. The opportunities for students from different programs and different faculties to mingle is fairly strong, but the opportunities for them to work together on projects where they draw on their disciplinary expertise is very, very weak. So this is a kind of a nice feature, I would say, of the zone learning model. It brings people from various disciplinary backgrounds together and allows them to work together on an idea. So in terms of zone learning as an educational experience, it's a set of, or it's structured as a set of events. They can be lectures, they can be seminars, workshops, opportunities to interact with mentors, guidance from zone learning responsible staff who give advice, but also provide feedback to help the students develop their ideas. The zones themselves are incubators. They are spaces where the students can go and work together. So they provide infrastructure and physical space. They are places where the mentorship activities can go on. They're places where community connections and network can be developed. So the way I kind of try to summarize this is to say that, if zone learning is the curriculum, the zones are the classrooms, just to kind of make it connect to what people are a bit more familiar with. So just to summarize this very quickly, this whole slide, zone learning, a type of curriculum, takes place in the classrooms that we call zones. The nature of the curriculum is intended to mimic startup culture, startup activities, and allow the students to work on projects that would be considered startups. So that's a quick description of zone learning. What are the objectives of zone learning? What does it say about itself? What does it claim to do? Well, it says that it will provide students with practical experience in the things that are required to build an initiative or a venture from the ground up, whatever that may mean, technical skills, soft skills, advice from mentors, whatever it may be, the amount of effort that's required, the amount of change in direction that may be required. If I've worked on a topic, for using a particular approach for 6 weeks and nothing's happened, maybe I need to change direction. How do I change direction, and what do I change direction to? To develop valuable skills through the events, the workshops, the boot camps, interaction with peers and mentors, and so on. And again, I've mentioned skills earlier. I'm going to mention them now, and I'll mention them again later. The acquisition of what some people would call soft skills is an important feature of what zone learning tries to deliver. So giving students an opportunity to learn how to collaborate effectively with others, to learn how to communicate effectively with others, to acquire persistence, things of that nature. These are some of the things that the zone learning experience is meant to convey. Adding experience to a student's resume or portfolio with quote unquote real world experience. I don't really know what real world means, but the point here is really that if I'm graduating with my BSc in chemistry and I have done a 3-month stint in a zone, and I can put that in my CV, well, maybe that gives me a bit of an edge when I am applying for jobs. Employers might look at that and say, that's interesting. That's a little unusual. Maybe that could be a sign that this person has something that they can offer beyond what we typically see with a graduate with a BSc in chemistry. One of the objectives potentially is that a student can graduate with their own startup. So that doesn't, to be frank, happen very often, but it can happen and does occasionally happen. And in the case of graduate students, really to connect them with people who may be potential users of their research outcomes. So those are some of the objectives that the zone learning apparatus at Ryerson claims for itself. Yes, okay, I will continue. So has zone learning been popular? I would say it's been sort of popular. So as it says here, popular-ish. So this is a graph which my colleagues at Zone Central provided me with rather. And you can see the way enrollment in the zones has changed over time. Just a little bit over 50 people enrolled in the spring of 2013 when it first started, going up to just around 830 people in the winter of 2019. I can add one additional data point from the most recent information that was provided to me from Zone Central. The enrollment about 900 in the fall of 2020. So, you know, on the positive side, the upward slope is very nice. We see the participation growing slowly over time. However, to keep it all in perspective, Ryerson has now about 45,000 students. So 900 students is really only about 2% of the student population. So clearly, although in spite of all this growth that's happened over the years, it's still a minority taste, to put it that way. So why is that? And I personally think one of the reasons is the reason that I'm going to present on the next slide, because there has never been up until now a formal connection between zone learning activities and formal degree completion requirements. So again, if I'm a BSc student in chemistry, I might be very interested in taking part in the zone experience, but I have all my third and fourth year courses I need to deal with, my fourth year thesis project, things of that nature. I may find that I just can't fit it in, especially if I have to work in the summer to make money to cover my costs. So the fact that up until now, zone learning can't be used towards completion of a degree, I think is a feature that has kept students away, although it doesn't cost anything. So Ryerson students can participate in this without paying any fees for it, up to now at least. However, so I think that's a big factor in keeping the participation numbers low compared to the total number of students at the university. However, things are starting to change. As of this fall, for the very first time, students can take a minor in innovation and zone learning at Ryerson, which they can, if their program's curriculum structure is flexible enough, they can count those credits towards their degree completion. So this is the very first time there's been a formal integration or interconnection, I guess, of the zone learning experience and formal curriculum at Ryerson. There have been some informal things that have been going on for quite a while. So fourth year engineering students, for example, do have to complete a design project as part of their engineering degree. Some of them have chosen to do it in a zone. So their zone project becomes their design project, but they submit it to their engineering program officials and get it graded in a traditional fashion. So this is informal, but it does happen. Similar thing goes on in the business faculty. There's an upper level business course where the students are meant to identify a client and act as a consultant to that client. And some of those business students have thought, those zones have lots of small businesses in them. Maybe we can use them as our clients. And that's worked out quite well. So the business students have been able to act as consultants to some of those zone firms, and the zone firms get sort of pro bono advice from the business students. So it's been quite helpful, but again, it's completely informal. York University has also started down the pathway of trying to connect what I would call startup mimic curriculum, something like zone learning, to formal programming, but they've done it in their continuing education unit. So they have a number of certificate programs in their continuing education unit that students can take and get a certificate of some sort. And they've set up what they call an entrepreneurship initiative, which is a kind of a startup mimic along the lines of zone learning. And students who are pursuing those certificate programs can take this if they wish as a complement to the programming that they're taking. And I think I mentioned at the outset, entrepreneurship courses and degree programs have sprouted up across the entire university sector. And this is just a small sampling of some of the universities in Ontario that have these types of activities, more traditional courses and degree programs, but focused on entrepreneurship. So all of this by way of saying, universities, I think, understand that if they really want to make this startup mimic educational experience meaningful and viable in the long term, they do have to find ways to connect it to degree programming. So what about success? It's fine to talk about doing stuff. Is it successful, and how do we measure success? So I have a few different slides on this, and I'm going to look at it in a bunch of different ways. So the first way I'm going to look at it is what I would call typical startup metrics. So those are things like, how many firms were launched from this zone learning incubator that you have going, Chris? How many investment dollars did it attract? How many jobs did it create? These are typical metrics that are used to assess the validity of small firms. They're popular with the provincial government in terms of adjudicating or evaluating the economic impact of any kind of activity across the board, including what the universities are doing. Ryerson does this. The zone learning system talks about these kinds of things. Other Ontario universities that have created similar startup mimics also emphasize these types of features. And again, part of it is to connect with government priorities. But I would say, this is fine as a marker of success as far as it goes, but it's, in my mind, definitely insufficient. The universities that are doing these kinds of things, Ryerson included, often emphasize other types of outcomes, such as student learning, as a reason for doing it, but then they focus on these kinds of metrics: firms launched, investment, jobs created, things of that nature. So there's a real disconnect there, I think, in the way the universities want to describe these activities and the way they evaluate whether they're being successful or not. So that's one way of looking at things. Another way of looking at things is related to student learning. Right? If universities are educational institutions, which of course they are, and they're providing an opportunity for students that is meant to be a student learning experience, let's figure out ways to find out whether the students are actually learning things or not. So evaluating students' performance is another way of judging the success or lack of success of startup mimics like the zone learning experience. So how much learning is actually taking place? And it turns out this is actually not that easy to do. And as a result, it's kind of a work in progress. It's still an ongoing challenge, even though these startup mimic educational experiences have been around for a while. I don't think anybody has really figured out a really solid way to evaluate student performance in these kinds of settings. So, and I think part of what's driving that is the fact that they are trying to mimic startup culture. Startup culture is by definition unstructured. There's frequent redirections of focus because I tried this and it didn't work, so I'm going to try something else instead. This is very different from the more linear start at a foundation and build upward approach that we see in most university courses and programs. So another way of putting it is the startup culture model is not that amenable to the traditional evaluation tools that we use in a university. It's not that amenable to testing. It's not that amenable to having students write essays or other types of assessment tools that we typically see. And just to kind of emphasize that, I'm currently running a very small research project at Ryerson about student assessment in the zones. And part of that is interviewing the people that are responsible for delivering the zone activities. And one zone manager, when I interviewed her, admitted that their system for evaluating acceptable participant progress is, quote unquote, kind of impressionistic. So not really that kind of focused or specific. On the other hand, each of the zones, they do try hard to come up with an explicit set of assessment criteria. So they do things like monitor how frequently the students interact with mentors. They'll set threshold content values for things like business plans. Does the business plan that the student or the team that they've developed, does it meet some basic requirements of a business plan? How often do the students participate in training events at the zones? Things of that nature. So, I mean, I think they're trying. I would say most of those things probably don't really get at student learning. They're probably a bit like a proxy for student learning. But to be fair, I'm not sure that multiple choice exams get at true student learning either. And of course, those are widespread in the university sector, as I'm sure you all know. So, there's a lot of room to do stuff, make this kind of thing more focused. It's a work in progress, as I said. Another way of looking at success is to ask the students what they think. So the next two slides provide a little bit of insight into what the participants in these zones think about what the zones are delivering to them. So I've mentioned a couple of times the idea of skills acquisition. Over here on the left column of this table, you see a whole bunch of skills described. These come from the Conference Board of Canada, and the Conference Board of Canada describes them as 21st century economic skills. So the types of skills that people who want to thrive in the 21st century world of work should at least have some proficiency in. And you can see that none of them are things like design an electronic circuit, program a computer, or do a chemical analysis using fancy instrumentation. They are things like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, leadership, perseverance, and so on. So these are the soft skills that the zones are trying to encourage students to become more proficient in. And these numbers over here are averages of student responses to a 4-point scale, where the question was, did you feel that your zone experience helped your acquisition of each of these skills? And the scale, as I mentioned, was a scale of 1 to 4, where 4 is, yes, I agree strongly that my zone experience helped me acquire, let's say, a collaboration skill, and 1 is the opposite. I totally disagree with that. And you can see the numbers fall between, the average numbers fall between 3 and about 3.5. So what it says is that the students feel they are acquiring these skills kind of in a not too bad to so-so fashion. They're not stellar, but they're not terrible by any stretch of the imagination either. And the people who wrote this report, this color shading comes from them. They tried to cluster the responses into a set of skills that the students seem to acquire more successfully, or believe they acquired more successfully versus ones where that was not the case, where the acquisition of those skills was weaker. I would say the differences in these numbers are not that dramatic, so take it with a grain of salt, but that was the conclusion that the authors of this paper were trying to promote. We've also been doing, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a little bit of a research project at Ryerson around the zone learning experience. Our focus has really been on trying to understand assessment tools, but we also asked similar questions about skills acquisition. And what we found was the 3 categories of skills that came to the top in terms of students' perception that they had actually found the zone experience helpful for strengthening or acquiring those skills were, for me, very interestingly, self-reflection, critical thinking and problem solving, and communication and collaboration. The other skills that were on that previous slide, they were all ranked much lower. So I think the message from these 2 slides is that students feel they are actually getting some training in these skills, but they perceive that the zone experience delivers those skills in an uneven fashion. Pardon me, I'm just going to have a sip of water. And one last idea about how one might go about judging success is this one here. I call this avoiding the rabbit hole. This is actually something that I kind of thought about when I read an article that Warren sent me about this topic earlier in the summer, an article by Friedman and Friedman from 2021. And in this article, they made the statement that academic departments have become insular silos that encourage the absurd belief that one discipline is superior to others and can provide all the answers. So the rabbit hole being that, universities, the focus on research has become so phenomenally narrow that although there are all these people with all these expertise working in the same building and down the hall from one another, that there's virtually no cross-fertilization of the ideas that are being developed. And I, from my own experience as a long-term university citizen, I would say that there's certainly more than a grain of truth in this statement from Friedman and Friedman. So, taking that as a premise, I would say to the extent that the startup culture mimics that we have encourage collaboration across disciplines, this kind of works against this rabbit holeization, if I can say it that way, of the universities. These startup mimics, because they bring students from various disciplines, various faculties together and have them work together on projects, provides an opportunity for exactly the kind of cross-fertilization of ideas that Friedman and Friedman are worried doesn't happen in the university sector. And just as two examples from the zones that I can mention to kind of illustrate this, there has been a group where fashion students work together with chemistry students to design sustainable lab coats. Another example I can refer to was media students working with computer science students to develop and tell a digital-based stories, or a database story rather, around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So I think that these kinds of cross-fertilizations don't happen in a normal classroom. Even in a classroom where, like it's a liberal arts elective that may bring students from many different faculties, they don't get this opportunity to work together typically in those kinds of settings. So I think that this is potentially another way of viewing the success of the startup mimic approach. So that's my story about zone learning. I'm going to move on to the last substantive part of my talk. Where are we right now in terms of all of this? And the way I'm going to try to frame this and answer that question is to consider what one might do if one wanted to launch a startup mimic like zone learning at your university. So the OECD has been very helpful in this by promoting a set of concepts or activities that they believe are supportive of helping integrate startup culture into universities. So one is a strategic thing. Does the focus on entrepreneurship and does the focus on entrepreneurship and startup culture align with the strategic mandate or the mission of the university? So before I move on from that point, virtually every university that I looked at, I did take some time to look at their mission statements and things of that nature. Virtually every university in Ontario does say something about part of its mission is to serve society, but it's often phrased in terms like to contribute and enrich the intellectual and cultural life of the province or of the country. Only 2 universities in Ontario could I find where entrepreneurship was explicitly mentioned in their strategic material about as a strategic mandate or priority for the university. So not all universities would necessarily see entrepreneurship or startup culture as aligned with their self-image in terms of their mission statements. So that's one thing. The second thing is a long-term financial stability. There has to be some source of funds to allow, if you do launch a startup mimic like zone learning or something along those lines, you do need some financial stability. You need to have a way to keep it going. Connected to that, it needs an administrative infrastructure. So even though the number of students enrolled in zone learning at Ryerson is only 2% of the student body, it's still almost 1,000 students. That requires a lot of backroom support from the registrar's office. It needs people to run the actual zone spaces, to act as advisors to the students, and things of that nature. So the whole administrative structure needs to be developed. There has to be a commitment to entrepreneurship education at the university, preferably, ideally integrated with curriculum. And as I mentioned earlier, that seems to be something that's just starting to happen. And that educational effort should be evidence-based. It should be based on, its design should be based on pedagogic research. And I would say, in my experience, that hasn't really happened. That's still a big gap in all of this stuff. There's lots of scope for pedagogy researchers to get there, to roll up their sleeves and do work on understanding better the educational value of startup mimics like Zone Learning. There has to be support for the startups once they get up and running, and there have to be some criteria for success defined by the university for itself. So that's what the OECD tells us. So to kind of riff off some of that, I'll ask the questions that are posed on this slide. Is this agenda relevant to all universities? Or putting it another way, is the creation of a startup mimic like Zone Learning likely to work at all institutions? I would say probably not, partly because it may not align with the strategic focus of the university, as I mentioned on the last slide. There is going to be skepticism on the academic side about the academic value of startup culture and entrepreneurship. When we tried to launch Zone Learning back in 2012-13, we took it to the academic senate for approval. And what we got back from them was a list of 53 questions they wanted answered. The responses to those 53 questions ended up being almost as many pages long as the proposal for Zone Learning was. So there is skepticism, and I think the skepticism is fair. Many of those questions were quite reasonable questions, and it was actually valuable for us to respond to them, think them through. And in the end, the Senate did approve this, and it is running as you now know. There's a belief that entrepreneurial activities and things of that nature are not widely relevant across disciplines, that they may be relevant for engineers, scientists, and business people, but maybe not so much for social workers. And I would actually dispute that. I would say that, in fact, the ideas of entrepreneurship can be applied in almost any discipline. And I'll give you an example at the very end, a bit of an anecdote to illustrate what I'm talking about. Universities also have variable levels of resourcing. Some have fairly large operating budgets with a certain amount of discretionary funds in them, others not so much. So if there is no source of sustainable funding, either from the university's own resources or if it can be attracted from outside somehow, then it's hard to do this. And then location matters too. So if I want to launch a startup mimic in downtown Toronto, Toronto has a very diverse set of economic domains: finance, health sciences, biotechnology, media, you name it. There's a whole bunch of different things going on in Toronto. Similar story in Ottawa. And so I can tap into mentors from all of those areas. They're people who live locally. But if I try to migrate this whole idea, let's say, to North Bay, the diversity of economic activities there is narrower, which automatically limits the range of mentorship that I might be able to access locally. So the location can play a role too. So this can work against the ability of an individual university potentially to launch a zone type experience or a startup mimic, to maybe give it a more generic name. And Warren, I'm keeping an eye on my stopwatch here. I know I'm running out of time, so I will try to get through this quickly. One of the questions I posed in my summary for the Almont lecture was, is this just a passing fad or is it here to stay? And I would say that it's here to stay. And I'm going to give two bits of information to support that. And the first one is what's shown here. Between 2011 and 2016, a campus-linked accelerator program in Ontario received over $260 million of financial support. About 17% of that total came from a combination of provincial and federal government funding. A very large proportion came from private investing, and then from other sources such as loans and credit, or again, to emphasize how tiny startups can be, friends and family contributing cash to help keep the lights on. So, that's a lot of money to be spent over a 5-year period. I think it indicates that that level of investment indicates a significant level of interest that is likely to translate into longevity. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get more recent data than this, so that's why the data is a little bit old. The second point around this, which is kind of similar, I call it keeping the lights on. And this goes back again to some comments that Warren made at the outset about the bottom line being so important. Perhaps some of you know, maybe many of you know, that the operating budgets of universities in Ontario, about 95% of the dollars come from sources that are controlled by government policy, partly from student tuition fees, partly from government grants. The government grants used to be allocated on a strictly per capita basis. So for every enrollment that you had, if it had been approved by the government, they would send you money. It's still mostly like that, but several years ago, they added a new wrinkle to what they call the funding formula. They introduced 10 performance metrics to evaluate how universities were doing in terms of topics that were relevant in the mind of the government to contributing to society in a positive way. So those 10 metrics fall into two broad categories, and these are phrases that come from the provincial government itself: skills and job outcomes, and economic and community impact. So these types of things are now part of how the government chooses to allocate funds to universities in Ontario. I think the alignment of these kinds of words with the kinds of things I've been talking about in terms of the startup mimic educational approach, I think is fairly clear. So I think I could make the claim without too much concern about being embarrassed that universities that emphasize 21st century skills, startup culture, and things of that nature are likely to be able to check off many of the boxes in these performance metrics in a way that the governments would view in a favorable light. So I think the fact that the government has gone down this road puts a constraint on the university system to follow suit, if I can put it that way. So almost done. I see I'm 44 seconds over, so I'll try to wrap it up really quickly. Should universities teach startup culture? I would say overall, yes, in my opinion. I hope I've been able to indicate that to the extent that teaching startup culture conveys and reinforces skills that are useful for students and part of the student, useful part of the student experience, and therefore that they should be part of the university education. I hope I've been able to make that point. I will refer to the cooperative education model, which has been around for decades. It does have a sort of, not exactly the same, but similar focus. And nobody questions its value. I could see the startup mimic education approach kind of moving towards a revised or reimagined form of co-op over time. And I would say that the startup form, the startup way of thinking, the startup approach is special and valuable and can be applied across virtually all academic disciplines. And I'll end up by telling you a little story. I've got a couple of photos here you can see. One is a woman who is a pastor, and we see this other fellow here who this young man who maybe looks a little bit like a startup bro. He's young, he's wearing casual clothing, and he's got a fancy phone in his hand. Which one is the entrepreneur? And the reason I'm putting this up is because I wanted to use it as a way to tell you a small story, a very short story. So several years ago, I had the opportunity to speak about assessment of learning in zone learning at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And because it was billed as a sort of educationally related talk, there were people from the education faculty, there were some people from the faculty of science and engineering and so forth. And at the end of the Q&A, when the lecture was over, the people that hung around and wanted to talk more about it, surprise to me, they were all from the faculty of theology. And the reason that they were particularly interested was the University of Stellenbosch's faculty of theology trains Doctor of Divinity students from the entire continent of Africa and even elsewhere on the planet. And they told me that, the people who come here to do a Doctor of Divinity, they're not really interested in being a pastor at your neighborhood church. They want to do something beyond that. They want to do something like set up an NGO with a humanitarian focus. And the fact of the matter is our faculty members don't know how to train them in the skills to do that. And they were intrigued by the idea of zone learning as a sort of hands-on approach to learning some of the skills necessary to launch, for example, a humanitarian NGO. So I think just to leave you with the idea that entrepreneurship is not a dirty word. It can be applied in all kinds of fields. It can be used to make business and buy your next Ferrari, but it's not limited to that. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention rather, and I'll stop sharing the screen. And hopefully, if you have questions, I'll be able to answer them. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. It's a different world.
Yes.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I think I see Mel's hand up, and he's also clapping. So thank you, Mel.
Yep. So, Mel here. It's a long time since I've been at university, more than 50 years now. But in those days, the idea was to teach students how to think, not how to do. Obviously, there's been huge changes in the other direction since I was there. I'm not sure people who coming from universities, my experience of hiring new students, is that they are good at thinking anymore. I hear them parroting a lot of silly ideologies, identity politics and the like. But anyway, I think certainly entrepreneurship is a skill that's very useful. I've been very interested in hearing what you've had to say. But I do wonder whether it's appropriate to the large amount or large proportion of university students. The entrepreneurs I've known in my life, and I've been one myself, are very few, as sort of a unique bunch of particular personality traits and skills that certainly do not apply to the vast variety of people coming through the universities. So I just wonder whether either the naming or the approach shouldn't be more towards creativity, which I note was the highest scoring learned skill, which obviously is a very useful skill no matter what job you end up in. Anyway, I'd appreciate your comment on whether you think this is applicable to a broad raft of students.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question, Mel. And the short answer is absolutely not. I think you've been very clear in making the point that not everybody can be an entrepreneur. But so I think the short answer is no. There will always be some self-selection by students who, for one reason or another, think that this is something for them. So I don't think it's something that will be applied across all students. But what I will say, and to some extent, the zone learning system at Ryerson tries to accommodate this, there will be those students who, in their own inner person are entrepreneurs and want to come in and do something and build something up. But there will also be people who want to kind of get a flavor of what that's all about, to try and understand it and maybe contribute to it in a sort of tangential way. So there's a range. In fact, I didn't want to go into this much detail, but I will, since you raised the question. At the zones at Ryerson, at least, there are different types of participants. There are people who are, what you might call team leaders or founders. Those are the ones with the sort of more real entrepreneurial spirit. There are others that they're often called associates or affiliates or interns or something like that, who come in because they want to take part in this, they want to learn something about it, get a flavor of what it is, but they don't see themselves necessarily doing this as their main focus. So hopefully that addresses your question. And just to kind of maybe go a little further with it too, I mentioned that the limited amount of data we have suggests that those various skills are communicated with varying degrees of success to students. That may reflect, to some extent, the student's own interests rather than the ability of the zones to convey anything. Students who come in with that entrepreneurial fire in their bellies may tune into using those skills more frequently and more effectively than others who come in just with the idea of kind of testing the waters and getting a feeling for what it's all about. Richard, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I did. Chris, thanks very much for this. This is most interesting from a former administrator's point of view. I wondered, of course, this applies to students fairly obviously, but I wonder to what extent faculty members themselves are interested in this. So I could certainly see this being valuable. Lots of faculty members are quite innovative and quite entrepreneurial, but they often could use some support in doing that as well. So did you get much interest from other faculty members on this?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I had originally had a slide to actually address that, but I found out if I included that, I'd be speaking for an hour. So I decided to trim it out. But the short answer is the faculty uptake or the faculty engagement with this has been pretty modest. Some faculty members from our engineering faculty have gotten involved. Some faculty members from our design faculty have gotten involved. Some people from our science faculty have gotten involved, but if you look more widely across the university, not so much. And I think it's due to several factors. I think there is perception in some quarters that entrepreneurship is a dirty word because it's so frequently associated with business success. That may be a factor. I think there's some concern among faculty members that if they work with students in a zone and some really, really potentially valuable innovation or idea or invention comes out of that there's going to be some sort of turmoil about intellectual property ownership. But I think probably the thing that is the biggest impediment for faculty participation is the things that they need to do to build their own careers. So as you know, I mean, publish or perish is real. People are busy with their research. People are busy with teaching and the service that they do to the university. They might find that getting involved in zone learning is one thing too many, and its relationship to their career development is not that clear. So I think those are some factors that have inhibited faculty participation, and it's a real shame. It would be wonderful to get faculty involved, for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Jan, you have a question?
Yes, a couple of comments, as a matter of fact. Very interesting. I'm involved in science fair across Canada and the Canada-wide science fair. And hang on, sorry. And what I find very interesting is that the Canada-wide science fair is moving very much towards this entrepreneurial problem-solving mode for awarding prizes, and also for making sure that the students who participate actually do problem solve. Yeah. And in fact, York University offers an entrepreneurial boot camp and to the winners of about 20 students. And I know that 2 of our students from Rideau St. Lawrence went to the York University Entrepreneurial Boot Camp. So there seems to be quite a movement with younger, perhaps students, to bring them into this kind of an idea, which I think is points to the fact that it'll be a continuing and ongoing part of the university culture.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jan. I mean, I think it's become over time. I mean, yeah, it's become over time more and more pervasive in the university sector, for sure. But I still, there's hesitation. And I think the hesitation comes from some of the things that Warren mentioned at the very outset. Should the university, and Mel echoed this too, should the universities not be more about training people in thinking? Is skill development really what the universities should be doing? And those are still open questions. I mean, Ryerson, as you may know, it's over 70 years old now as an institution, and throughout all those 70 years, its educational focus has always been on, career relevant education, like do this and get a job, get these skills, get a job. That's the way it's always been. It's evolved into the way it is now as a modern university, keeping tapped into that root tradition of career relevance. But even at a university like that, which had decades and decades of this sort of focus on the job market, career development, and so forth, it was really tough to get this through our academic senate for all of the reasons that have been raised here tonight. Skepticism, what is the value? Do students really learn anything? All of those kinds of things. And I think, although I'm kind of a fan of this stuff, partly because I was involved in its development, I'm also very aware that many of those are still open questions that really need to be dealt with.
Thank you,
Christopher. John here. I really found your lecture very, very interesting, and I would encourage you, because I think, I think universities have become multiversities, and I think education is just scattered into many different avenues. And I think we need to push forward on as many as we can to see what kind of success we can find. I think there's a very wide variety of students now. And some of them are very entrepreneurial. And I think what this does is it provides an avenue for them. And I think, I think it's a program that's pretty young in its development stage. And I think it should be allowed to grow and show its merit. I just think what you're doing is right. And I think because they're multiversities now. They're really not universities in the old style. And that doesn't mean that a strand of the old style university can continue to exist within the multiversity. But I think we have to push on with as many avenues as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that quote from the Friedman and Friedman article about the siloization of the universities, I mean, that certainly rang true in my experience. And it's really a shame. I mean, there's so many ideas circulating in any university. The idea that those ideas don't somehow interact with one another and reinforce and grow one another is really an unfortunate thing. So yeah, I think I agree with you. That's for sure. So thanks for your comments, Peter.
Yes, I was also in administration for a long time, and I found the most difficult thing to do when you wanted to introduce something new was firstly to get approval for it. And you've discussed a lot about that, but then much more difficult is actually getting funding. So I'm curious to know, how much does the program cost to run at Ryerson, and where does the sort of administrative money come from?
Right. So I cannot answer the first part of your question because I'm not intimately involved in the operation to that extent. So how much it actually costs, I don't know. But what I can tell you a little bit about how it has been funded over the years. Initially, for example, that first iteration, the DMZ, which or perhaps the DMZ, as we should call it here in Canada, that was really funded through an allocation from operating funds. The president just decided that this was something that he wanted to do. So he said, to the provost, find X number of tens of thousands of dollars, let's rent this space and let it happen. And a lot of the ongoing evolution of both DMZ and then later zone learning has been funded by operating dollars. But Ryerson did a very sneaky trick. And I hope I'm not letting any cats out of any bags here, but back when zone learning was being proposed and created, it was set up in such a way that it was a 4-credit activity through our continuing education unit, which meant that enrollments were eligible for government grants. So that was the way the sort of sustainable financing was done. Whether the government would fall for that trick again, if somebody else came forward with it, I'm not sure, but I guess we had that. What is that? There's that phrase, first mover advantage, I guess. So yeah, so that's part of how it was funded. But over time, it's also been through investment. Individuals have. So I think often what happens is one of the zones will approach someone who's been successful in some domain, whether it's social innovation or financial, entrepreneurship or biomedical entrepreneurship, and ask if they would be willing to help out as a mentor. And actually, people are very generous. They're often very willing to spend some time on a volunteer basis helping students, it turns out. I think some of those people have been intrigued enough by the whole operation to actually provide donations to help run it as well. And then finally, government funds. So the government of Ontario for a number of years ran I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was a fund to support campus-based incubators and accelerators. And through applications to that type of thing, Ryerson was also able to access some money. So that partially answers your question, I hope. By the way, Peter, can I ask you a question? Are you have you been a physics professor at Ryerson, or sorry, at Carleton? I mean,
Yeah, for a number of
yeah, I think you taught me once upon a time.
Rick is laughing.
Yes. Well, Peter is the physics professor for Carl.
Okay, all right, then my memory is not faulty.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I'd just like to add some comments. I've really been quite fascinated by this talk. A good number of years ago, because I've been retired a while now, I represented Mitel Corporation's efforts to work with universities via small grants to stimulate research projects on issues that were important to us, and we felt that this was worthwhile from the point of view of solving some important problems, and at the same time directing research, applied research, in directions that were in fact worthwhile. So that at the time, I'm talking about the 90s, and that seemed like quite a step forward. Yeah. So I'm absolutely fascinated to listen to Chris really describing essentially the next step forward, right? Which is to introduce students to the idea of taking their ideas, making sure they really are practical, and then making the big leap into commercialization. So this is, for me, has been a really fascinating talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Just on that note, and I guess, going back to what Richard said earlier about faculty involvement, the other thing that's unfortunate, at least at Ryerson, is there hasn't been a strong connection between the research agenda of the university and these zone activities. That may change over time, but I think, again, it's probably partly driven by faculty not maybe seeing how this activity will contribute to their career growth, and maybe anxiety about intellectual property as well.
Yeah,
but I think it would be amazing if all of those ideas that are floating around in the research environment could somehow play into this as well.
Yeah, I have to say I was very impressed with all the research profs that I dealt with at Carleton, at University of Ottawa, at McMaster, and so on. Yeah. Incredibly hardworking people. I always thought that professors have found the least efficient way of converting intellect into income. Right?
Yeah,
really lovely people, and we got a lot of interesting work done, and they were a joy to work with. So so it's interesting because we were careful to make sure that we understood. We needed to try and get something of value, at least from a learning point of view, but understood at the same time it's important for the prof to get students through that process and for them to further their own research. Yeah. And I think that's very important. And the other point that comes to mind, you mentioned intellectual property a number of times. One of the things that we did right up front was to actually agree an intellectual property agreement with the university, get that dealt with, so it's not an issue hanging there. You don't know what's going to happen. You do know what's happened. You've agreed to it already, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, there are definitely solutions to those kind of issues, but there are sometimes anxieties about them as well.
Well, and it's a perfect thing to get your law department or whatever involved. Draw up the agreements.
Yeah, for sure.
Is there one last question?
Yeah, I got another question for Chris. Chris, if you look down the road and this program really does take off, right now only about 2% of the population of the student body is really interested in this zone learning. Mm-hmm. But it's quite likely that if it does become very successful, you'll attract a wider audience. Yeah. How, based on, the difficulty of trying to evaluate people, how are you going to, have you given some thought into the future? Because how will you decide who qualifies to enter the program? becomes a very difficult thing because success attracts a lot of sort of people who really shouldn't be in the program.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. There are already in place criteria in these zones for admission, so not everybody who just walks in off the street would necessarily be admissible. They already have some criteria. The people who run the zones are kind of experts with, I guess, startup experience, you might say, in the various fields that are relevant. So they have some ability to assess the ideas that the students bring forward. They also look for things like, they use words like coachable. Are the students coachable? Will they take advice? Can they be, in essence, are they willing to learn, really? I guess is what it boils down to. So they do have some things of that nature already in place. But I think you're right. I mean, if the universities that are interested in this kind of thing can figure out ways to very seamlessly join together the startup mimic experience with degree requirements, I think that will open the door to a lot of student interest. Then it becomes an issue of screening to make sure the people who get in are the ones who are most likely to benefit and be successful. I mean, that happens a lot already in universities. Many universities have, GPA cutoffs for being able to take a fourth-year thesis project, for example, or some of the more performance. And I know this because it happens at Ryerson, where we have degrees in things like dance performance and so forth. It's not enough just to get great grades in your courses. You also have to be able to demonstrate a certain talent or facility with the art form, and maybe those kinds of or something akin to those could be used as screening tools to assess who is likely to be successful or not, and then decisions could be made. So I think there are ways to do it, but right now it's at a very primitive or preliminary stage, I would say.
Okay, if there are no more questions, Chris, I want to thank you very, very much for
my pleasure
taking the time and making the effort to give us a really interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I have to say, putting a talk like this together is it's a bit of work, but it's also kind of interesting. It forces me to bring my thoughts together in a slightly more coherent way than usual. And I really appreciate the questions and comments. I think they are really insightful. Yeah. You want one more, John?
No, it's my wife thinking that it was a clap, and so she wanted to give you applause.
Oh, we can do that.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
I also want to thank Glenda Jones, Jan Johns, and Mel Turner once more for their contributions to getting this up and running. I especially want to thank the audience for listening and asking such good questions.
Yeah. Thanks for taking some time out of your Friday evening, everybody.
A couple of quick announcements. As you've probably heard before, Almont Lectures is a 100% volunteer effort, but we still need to pay the Zoom fees and hum bills. So if you feel so inclined, even though these lectures are free, and you want to donate a small amount of funding for our startup, you can do so by going to the almontlectures.com webpage and looking at the upper right-hand corner where it says donate. Now, next month, on the 29th of October at 7:30, we're going to have Christine Rowe, who's the CEO of the Mississippi Mills Public Library, to talk about what I call the past, present, and future of public libraries, because they've changed quite dramatically in the past. And she, like Chris, is a very good speaker, so I highly recommend it. So with that, I'll say thank you all again for coming, and I hope to see you to hear Christine Rowe's talk next month.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.